Welcome to the Fertile Crescent, the birthplace of civilization. That's what many historians consider the Fertile Crescent, which is a large chunk of land between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea. Surrounded by desert and irrigated by two mighty rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Fertile Crescent occupies the region we now know as Iraq and Iran. These two rivers snake down the mountains into the Persian Gulf. They frequently overflowed their banks, leaving behind a rich soil that was ideal for growing crops. And as is always the case, water is what allow civilizations to grow powerful, having not only water, but the power over the water. On the Persian Gulf end of Mesopotamia was a region called Sumer, where farmers built villages that grew and grew and grew. These early settlers built homes using bricks made from the mud of the Tigris and the Euphrates, and around 3000 BCE, there were enough houses to start making small cities. Farmers worked together to create irrigation and drainage ditches to direct water, like we saw in the video that we watched in class, where they wanted it, so they would direct the water to go where it wanted, and it would keep the river from flooding and destroying their cities. By this time, many city-states had grown in the Fertile Crescent, so down here in the area called Sumer, which is the little orangey area there, you will see that while Sumer is the city-state, there are cities inside of that city-state, like Nippur, the one we talked about in our video. City-states were just as they sound, cities that were so large and so independent that they became like states are today. They each had their own ruler, and each had their own justice system and trade and military, so they were all considered Sumer, but they really didn't have anything to do with each other outside of trade with one another. The Sumerians are credited with some of the most amazing inventions in human history. They invented the arch, which is what you see here. That concept that if you build bricks a certain way, support them a certain way, you can have this arched entryway. They made wagons, which was the first ever rolling vehicle. Some people say they actually invented the wheel, some think that happened before them. They accurately tracked the stars and came up with the zodiac. They're the reason we have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. So they came up with all of that. You can thank the Sumerians for that. The Sumerians were polytheistic, which means that they believed there was not one god but many. Each city-state had a favorite or patron god. In the video we watched in class in Nippur, that was spoken about, their patron god was the sun god. So you see here a ziggurat, and a ziggurat is a little bit like a pyramid, it's just not pointy at the top, and it was meant to honor the gods. They wanted the temple, which was at the top here, this blue part, and it would not have been blue, that's just to show you the levels, was at the top because the temple wanted to be closer to the gods, which would be up in the sky. It was often the centerpiece of a city-state, so a city-state would be built around this ziggurat. The Mesopotamians used etchings on stone tablets to tell stories and display their rules. They developed the earliest form of writing. The system used by Sumerian scribes was cuneiform, and it used small geometrical shapes scratched into wet stone, and the wet stone would dry, and that's how they would keep track of trades and taxes and military issues and anything that they wanted to make sure to keep track of. So because of cuneiform and because so many people use cuneiform, we now have written records to go back into history and look at and read and learn about these people. This is an administrative tablet. It has a male figure, hunting dogs, boars, so maybe it was used to track what this particular male owned or had sold. And it's from 3100 to 2900 BCE, would be about around the time that this cuneiform tablet was created. So, nothing lasts forever. Sumer was soon taken over by the Acadians. Sargon, the leader of the Acadians, he's thought to be the first ruler in world history to have a permanent standing army at his command. They also think he's the first to have his army use bow and arrows in battle. He was the emperor of the Acadians around 2000 BCE, and you see all that blue area on this map. That's what he took over. It's a pretty large area. It's a lot larger than Sumer. It was a vast kingdom. Nobody had ever seen this before. This is the world's first empire. Impressive as it was, Sargon's empire can't last forever either. All empires are based on power, which is based on the threat of violence a lot of times. Whoever has the strongest army, that's who's going to be in charge. So then the Babylonians came next. They took over this area. If you look at this map, you see the blue line. That would be what the Babylonians controlled. Not as large as the Akkadian Empire, but still pretty great. The Babylonians had Hammurabi as a leader, and Hammurabi is known for his code. The reason it's so famous is because they think this is the first written code of laws in the world. So Hammurabi's code was etched into a tablet. It included 282 laws, largely on the principle of retribution or revenge. If you poke out a free person's eye, your eye is poked out too. It also gave really harsh punishment for crimes, especially when they were committed by people of a lower class. Mesopotamian society was really strongly influenced by class, and it gave men a lot more rights than it gave women. And we'll talk more about Hammurabi's code in class, so you get some more details on that. You just need to know that it's the first written record right now. In about 700 BCE, the Assyrians, who lived in the hills up here, see Assyria, they moved down into the area that Hammurabi ruled. They had iron weapons, which the people in the south of Mesopotamia did not have, so they took over using that power, that strong army, to take over. The Assyrian army didn't last very long, less than a century. So the Assyrian Empire, however, you see, not the Assyrian, I said army, I meant empire. So the Assyrian Empire is all of this sort of peachy area, so they didn't last very long, but they have a huge area that they covered. Now, when the Assyrian army came into the area they were taking over, into Babylon, there's always three options. When you come into a city as a general, you have these three options. Do you take it over and occupy it? Do you take everything of value in it and then just leave? Or do you just destroy it? The Assyrians absolutely destroyed Babylon, tore it to the ground. But what they did is they tore Babylon down and then built a royal library. This library held a copy of one of the oldest stories ever written down, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a long poem about a legendary king named Gilgamesh. They're not sure if he existed or not, for real, but the epic tale is written down and contained a lot of myths, so whether he was real or not definitely the stories are a little bit made up there. And we will be reading pieces of the Epic of Gilgamesh in class. So after the Assyrians came the Chaldeans, and the Chaldeans came from present-day Syria. And their king, Nebuchadnezzar, who you may have heard about in the Bible, was the next great ruler of this area, and he rebuilt Babylon. He decided Babylon is really cool, and he wanted to rebuild it. So he made that almost like the capital of the region when the Chaldeans were in charge. The Greek historian Herodotus described it as having walls 56 miles long and 320 feet high, though they've dug it up and they say it's probably more like 10 miles long and not quite that high. A little bit of a hyperbole there. According to the Bible, the city center was the Tower of Babel, so you may have heard about that in the Bible. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Legend has it that they were built to please Nebuchadnezzar's wife, who missed the green, mountainous area that she came from before she married Nebuchadnezzar. So her husband built this giant garden overflowing with plants for her. They say that because all of this greenery was hanging, it looked like just a floating garden from a distance. Unfortunately, it was destroyed by earthquakes around 200 BCE, and some people argue whether it even existed or not. Along the Mediterranean coast, so down here near the Mediterranean Sea, right here, a unique civilization was doing things totally differently from Mesopotamia itself, and that was the Phoenicians. Their biggest legacy, or one of their legacies, is the modern day alphabet. You may have heard the term phonics. That comes from Phoenicians. So the modern day alphabet is descended from their alphabet. The Greeks took their alphabet, and then the Romans took their alphabet, and it's very similar to the ones that we use today. The Phoenicians also built a lot of really impressive ships, and their ships made it all over the place to Britain and the west coast of Africa, bringing wood and slaves and glass to the Greeks and the North Africans. So I want you to think about Mesopotamia and the Tigris and the Euphrates, and that's really where most of Mesopotamia dealt, right there in that same Tigris and Euphrates area. Here you have the Phoenicians reaching out everywhere, North Africa, up the coast, going up to Britain. I mean, this Italy, look at the little green lines, they were everywhere. So the Phoenicians expanded their influence. Mesopotamians kept it around themselves and traded up and down the Tigris and the Euphrates for the most part. But here are the Phoenicians branching out everywhere. The Phoenicians also invented glass blowing, which made really beautiful vases and decorations and things of that nature. But what they were really known for was their purple dye. Now get this, they got their dye from a sea snail that pretty much sneezed out the purple dye like achoo. So only the Phoenicians lived near those snails, so they had the only royal purple dye. It was so expensive that the dye itself was worth its weight in silver. Fun fact, the word Phoenician means purple people in Greece. So they were so famous for their purple dye that they were called the purple people. The same time as the Phoenicians and Nebuchadnezzar and the Hanging Gardens in Babylon, you had the Lydians in Turkey. They rose to power around 687 BCE. And they also did a little bit of trading with the Greeks, who were just starting to come to power around that point. We're going to talk about them in the future, so don't forget about that. What are the Lydians famous for? First gold coins. Money. They invented the concept of money like we know it today with coins and trading money for things. Before this, no government had ever come up with their own currency, their own money, so pretty cool. Also, around the same time, you have the Hebrews. So Canaan, which if you are familiar with the Bible, you've probably heard of Canaan. The Hebrews were organizing a state under a city of kings. The Hebrews, which we've talked about the Jews, the Hebrews, they differed from all the other cultures in the region because they were monotheistic, which means they only had one God. So they worshiped this God known as Yahweh. And they were nomadic, which we've talked about, meaning following the herd. So even though all of these areas around them are becoming agrarian and settling down, the Hebrews continued to be nomadic during all of this time. Now, if you need to, make sure you watch this video again. Do not forget to listen to the Flocabulary song and get your rap on about the Fertile Crescent.